Today ends the age of man.
Avengers? Show them what we got.
On May 1st,
Gentlemen, we're at war.
our greatest heroes
Stand and fight.
reassemble. How can you possibly stop me? We're the Avengers.
Did you forget?
Avengers: Age of Ultron.
Somebody want to deal with that bunker? Thank you.
Rated PG-13. Everywhere May 1st.
I'm Max Kellerman. Joining me right now, the editor-in-chief of TheUndefeated.com, which examines race and culture through the lens of sports, Jason Whitlock.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me.
Boxing people, they get their hackles up when they hear boxing is dead. Obviously, it's become increasingly marginalized in American culture. But that's interesting to me, this idea that racial progress has somehow been involved with the decline of American boxing. What do you mean by this?
Well, boxing at its birth, professional boxing at its birth in the late 1800s when John L. Sullivan became the first superstar athlete in American culture, at its birth, it was born into white supremacy. It was about the heavyweight champion being a symbolic symbol of white supremacy. And there was a color line in boxing where John L. Sullivan refused to box black boxers. Of course, 20 years later, 25 years later, Jack Johnson just shatters that, obliterates the color line.
Although he had to beat all the best black boxers to get his title shot against Tommy Burns, a white guy, but then he drew the color line too.
He did so because he recognized the narrative that drove boxing best and gave it traction was black-white tension and black-white, problems. And so he didn't, there was less money in fighting black boxers. There was far more money in taking on white hopes to take on Jack Johnson.
Ethnic, national, and racial rivalries have oftentimes fueled major events in boxing.
Yeah. And so what ends up happening in boxing for, Jack Johnson holds the title, and then when he finally loses to Jess Willard, I believe in 1915, boxing reinforces or reinstates the color line. They do everything they can for the next 20 to 25 years to keep a black champion away from the heavyweight title, and that symbolic title is the baddest man on earth. And that lasts until Joe Louis, who then becomes this great champion. And promoters, once Joe Louis has a successful reign, he's not as polarizing as Jack Johnson. Promoters realize, holy cow, there's a lot of money in the black-white narrative for boxing. And what ends up happening, the first thing that hurt boxing was World War II and the GI Bill, because that provided opportunities for poor white people to do other things other than boxing. And that eventually led to the exodus of white boxers. What ends up happening in the 1960s and early 70s is those pathways, those economic opportunities get extended to African Americans, and black boxers slowly start leaving boxing to pursue other sports, to pursue jobs where they weren't nearly as high risk as boxing. And so those two things, the exodus 25 years earlier of white boxers and then black boxers leaving, now you don't have that black-white narrative that drives American interests, and boxing's not as relevant in America.
That's a really interesting take. I can see, especially in the heavyweight division, where you say, where are the American heavyweights, or in this case, because generally they have been African-American heavyweights. In the NFL in the 70s, you couldn't make any money to play on an NFL line, and nowadays you make millions, and there are hundreds of jobs, and boxing is really the kind of sport you participate in if you have no alternative. And there are now more options for African-American men, large men, which is why the heavyweight division isn't what it used to be. But I look at other weight divisions in boxing. The best pound-for-pound fighter in the world is Floyd Mayweather, African-American. Second best is Andre Ward, African-American. In the top 10, just fought Terrence Crawford, African-American. Aren't there still African-Americans representing boxing?
They're still representing, but the depth of talent isn't there. And that's one of the things I want to discuss with you, given your passion for boxing, is with the lack of depth. Floyd Mayweather is not fighting in a great era of boxing. he's certainly not facing the level of competition, in my opinion, that Sugar Ray Leonard, Thomas Hearns, Hagler. Does that diminish Floyd's legacy and reputation? Richard Steele is quoted in our story saying, if Floyd beats Manny, he now surpasses Muhammad Ali as the greatest pound-per-pound boxer. Do you buy that?
Well, almost everyone. It's nearly unanimous among serious people in boxing that Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest pound-for-pound fighter ever. Very difficult to construct an intelligent argument against Sugar Ray Robinson. No, I don't think if Floyd beats Manny, he goes above Ali, but Floyd is among the best 10 or 15 fighters, pound for pound, who ever lived. I like this idea, though, that you bring up about what era you fight in. If you think about, I think people conflate the ideas of better and greater, and they're two distinct ideas. Every sprinter in the world today is better than Jesse Owens. Every one. You could look at the time. It's objectively measured. They're all better. How many are as great? We don't mean who's better. We mean how did you do in your era? And Floyd is dominating his era at the highest level, like Sugar Ray Robinson or Muhammad Ali or anyone you want to mention dominated their era. He's been the second best or best pound for pound since for 15 years. That's all, it may be unprecedented. Then you have to analyze the strength of the era. And there is something to be said for giving extra credit to people who come along and are the best at what they do in the classical era. When we know what we're dealing with, not in the infancy of a sport or a genre, but when that fully blooms. And it's difficult to pop your head out to the extent that Sugar Ray Robinson did because there's so many great fighters around. And if the argument is that boxing is now in decline, and certainly it's more marginalized, and you could argue fighters now, it's one of the few sports you could argue fighters now, because there aren't as many fights to be had, are not as good as they used to be, then you could also argue that Mayweather is dominating a less impressive era, and so there should be some discount compared to, for example, Sugar Ray Leonard, who came out on top of an incredibly competitive era. I think there's something to that.
Take other fighters, particularly in the 50s and 60s, who just quite frankly fought more often than Floyd. Floyd hasn't taken as many risks. He protects that O very passionately because I think he thinks that's going to make him the greatest of all time. Other fighters fought far more frequently, took more chances, and weren't diminished by a loss. They were actually elevated by avenging those losses, like Muhammad Ali with Frazier. But I'll say this, because this goes on in other sports as well, the point you're making. I've always discounted Babe Ruth as the greatest baseball player of all time because he played during segregation. He didn't face the best competition. I've always argued that John Elway is the greatest football player of all time, ahead of Jim Brown, because at the time Jim Brown dominated the NFL, no offense to Jim, it wasn't as fully formed. The best athletes weren't all playing. There was still a quota system. And so, to me, I think when I look at Floyd Mayweather, I can't put him on the same level as some of these other guys. One, he fights so defensively. When I think of Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns and those 8 minutes, could Floyd survive 8 minutes in a fight like that?
I actually think Floyd has underrated toughness. And the reason he hasn't had to do that is because he's negated what the other guy's trying to do. He deserves credit for that. But, you know, clearly Hagler and Hearns were taking more risks than Floyd. But here's another idea. The idea of natural selection is actually tautological, right? The parents who survive to pass on their genes are the ones who survive to pass, are best adapted to the environment. So here, Floyd Mayweather's not fighting in the 20s or the 80s. He's fighting over the last 15 years. And in this era, what you need to be able to do is fight a couple times a year and make sure you win every time. So I don't know if Floyd is successful in the 20s or the 1950s or the 1960s, but I know that he is best adapted out of everyone right now for this game. And that's the only way we really have to judge him. How did he do relative to his contemporaries? And then what do we think of his contemporaries? And I think so far, because he has been careful in terms of the selection of opponents, waited till Mosley got old, fought Canelo when Canelo was really still young, and who knows if Canelo's going to be a great fighter, waited to fight Pacquiao. You can discount it somewhat. But at a certain point, if he beats Pacquiao, say he beat Pacquiao, who's a phenom, He beat Canelo easily. I mean, won every round despite the ridiculous majority decision. He beat all these guys, and that's all he can do.
Final question, and we have to go. And we'll end on this. I won't ask for a prediction other than to say, will this be a great fight?
I think it's going to be a very good fight. I don't think it's going to be Mayweather-De La Hoya, which disappointed a lot of casual sports fans, even though they were boxing on a high level and Floyd won. Pacquiao knows he has to make the fight. He can't just let Floyd negate what he's doing and get out of the position, and it's not a good action fight. Pacquiao can't win a boxing match. So Pacquiao, if that starts to happen, will have to sell out, and that will give Floyd many more and better counterpunching opportunities. So I think we have a chance for a great fight. And surprise, like everyone thinks, well, if it's a knockout, it's Pacquiao. If it's a points win, it's Floyd. Pacquiao, if he hurts Floyd early, could overwhelm him, pile up points. I don't see Floyd getting himself knocked out. He's too good defensively, too much pride. Conversely, Pacquiao may feel like I'm behind on points. I got to make something happen. And Floyd is an underrated puncher. And Floyd could run into something big the way he ran Ricky Hatton into something big. So going into the fight, the possibilities, you know, there could be a counterintuitive kind of conclusion here. And I do expect it to be, at the very least, a really interesting, dramatic fight to watch.
A boring draw is what I predict.
A draw?
Rematch.
If it's a draw and it's a rematch, that means Pacquiao did really well.